Hi, it's Dave Kelly. I've arrived here at the Cash Marina in Turkey. It's another glorious winter's morning and I get to have breakfast on board Acheron with my mate Jim Furness. We're going to talk about army life as a 15-year-old entrant, learning to problem solve and how this led Jim to create his innovative industrial products business. Enjoy the episode. So Jim, good to see you again, mate.
Yeah, hey, nice to have you back.
Our Breakfast with Jim series, we've had our breakfast, which was very nice again.
Yep.
Cooked on the boat here on Acheron. So when I first met you, I was thinking, man, there's several interviews here, and so we did our first one.
Yeah.
Talked about all the spiritual things and the experiences you'd had, or some of them at least, in life.
Yeah.
But the thing that really captured my attention when I first met you was that you've developed this really interesting business where, and I'll get you to explain what that is, but it seemed very much that your training in the RAF when you first entered as a technician really helped you and set you up in conjunction with all the relationships and being able to deal with vendors, etc. And you really created a very unique business that's been, and your applications are all across the world. So I was wondering if you'd start from the top about when you first entered as a 15-year-old into the RAF.
Okay, yeah.
So I'll pour the coffee as you.
Okay, that's great. Yes. So I joined the RAF in 1971 when I was 15 years old. Which you could do then, and of course you can't do now. But
what did there was a particular term for that?
Yeah, well, it was an RAF apprenticeship, but we were known as boy entrants. And
boy entrants.
Yeah, and
but you couldn't say that.
Yeah, you couldn't say that now.
Anyway,
but I was actually 15 and a half when I joined, and they basically just took you from school. So you did a whole load of interviews and aptitude tests, but you didn't need any qualifications. They actually, so they gave you a maths test and a written English test and everything, and they just basically decided, well, if the right material is there, we'll teach you everything and we'll train you to do everything.
Right.
It was. I had this romantic ideal of what the Air Force would be. Having grown up in the 60s, watching movies like the Battle of Britain and reading stories about people like Douglas Bader and Guy Gibson.
Did it play out exactly that way?
Absolutely not. It couldn't have been further from the reality.
Right.
And so I left school knowing that I wanted to do something practical, and so I signed up for this. I was going to train as a aircraft navigation instruments technician.
Wow.
And so I think I assumed that because this is what I wanted to do, and I was obviously volunteering, that the military side of it would all be quite straightforward. But in fact, it's probably like deciding that you want to be an Olympic class marathon runner and thinking, well, just because I've decided I want to do it, it's all just going to happen.
Yeah, right.
Well, of course, it's not really like that.
Right.
And
well, in respect of just the fact that you needed to, you said that their part was that they want to identify good material.
Yeah.
And then from that point of view, then they've got to build a man around that boy.
Absolutely. And so when I joined up, it was a terrific shock. I mean, if you think you're a schoolboy, you've just come from home,
Tremendous shock.
Where mum makes you breakfast.
How long till your first stint when you got back home?
3 months. Yeah.
That would have felt like a long time.
It was 3 months, and it was... you went home in uniform. For those 3 months, you never wore civilian clothes once.
Wow.
And probably after a month, you were actually allowed off the base for an afternoon. You could go for a walk, but you had to go in your dress uniform. But it was a terrible shock. So when you arrive, everyone's very nice to you, and then that's fine. You think, oh, this is okay. And then you go and sign the drill instructors are very nice. Would you like to step this way, lads? And you okay? You've got everything you want. Just let us know. And you think, oh, what nice people! This is fantastic, And then you go and sign the enlistment papers, and they're still all very nice. Just want to come this way into the cinema. We're just going to take the oath, So then you put your hand up, and you take the oath of allegiance to the Queen.
Yeah.
And you finish taking the oath, and I mean, if you've never taken an oath before, it's actually quite a thing.
Right.
I mean, it's something which most people will never do in this day and age. But then as soon as you finish taking the oath...
Oh, literally?
Yeah, literally, as soon as you finish, it's gone from, okay, lads, everything is right. Right, you horrible fucking lot, line up and get in the queue. And they're all shouting at you. You go, what the bloody hell's going on?
That's what's
you have
happened
no
to them.
idea. And so, and you know, I joined the Air Force to, you know, kind of learn this trade,
Right.
being an electronics technician.
Yeah, yeah.
And I sort of very quickly discovered, as everyone else did, that that was part of it. But in order for them to kind of make us into what they needed us to be, there was a whole lot of other stuff that had to be done. And of course, when you're 15, you can't really understand it. So apart from our actual technical training, we were doing a lot of other stuff. We were doing a lot of drill on the parade ground, lots and lots of inspections, and you know, all that kind of stuff. And it just went on from whenever you started in the morning till about midnight, and you're just really exhausted the whole time, exhausted. Right. And I think that, you know, looking back now, I can understand what they were doing, because what they do is they basically take you apart and then put you back together again.
As they want.
But by the time they've put you back together, you're kind of 10 times the person that you were when you started. And
how long, when you say that putting back together, is that the initial 3 months? Or is that over a
No,
longer,
I would say...
You're talking a couple of years there, right?
Well, it was 2-year training, but I would say it took 6 months. And I actually remember us being called into the lecture room, and our flight commander coming along as a... and all our flight commanders were actually pilots. So that was one of the things that they did, is that all the officers were all aircrew, and rather than kind of administrative types, and you know, and he would actually say, right, you know, he said, you know, now after 6 months, you're now actually, you know, behaving, training like someone who's in the Air Force. We've kind of
we can start.
We can kind of really start now, and so there were lots of elements to this. I mean, I discovered, you know, strangely enough, that I actually really enjoyed drill. Right. You know, so everyone's supposed to hate drill.
Okay. And drill just purely being, is that with weapons, or it's with...
Well, with both. So you start off just kind of marching, and then you get on to kind of rifle drill. Right. And rifle drill is really, you know, I really enjoyed all of that aspect. It was also very funny, because I mean, you could, and the drill instructors were actually brilliant at their job. You know, perhaps a lot of people have watched that movie Full Metal Jacket, with Lee Ermey playing the Marine gunnery sergeant. He's a drill instructor. I mean, it starts his opening scene where he's just tearing these people apart. But he's actually doing it with huge intelligence, but he's just literally tearing them apart. And so the thing is that you're on the parade ground again. The drill instructor, the sergeant, says, you know, C flight, you know, turn to the left turn, and 99 guys turn left and one guy turns right. So the guy who's turned right is now facing the person who was behind him. Okay? So if that happens, you kind of go, oh shit, right? And so what you try and do is spin round very quickly, but it's too late because they've seen you. Right. Yeah. So they say, stand still! And then, so you've got to standing there, the guy who's facing you is kind of trying not to laugh. You know, and you're standing there, and then he'll walk right up and stand right behind your ear, and he'll say, are you deaf? Are you trying to spoil my parade ground? You know, and they'll just be shouting in your ear like that, you know. Are you trying to make fun of me? No, Sergeant. Are you sure? Yes, Sergeant. And so
did you? Was that, when you're saying you? Was that the first person you did that a couple of times yourself?
Yeah, I mean, that's happened to me. It happens to everybody at some point.
Right.
You know, and, you know, God help you if you dropped your rifle. You know.
Right.
So, but the thing was that they were actually performance artists. And I kind of understood, so what's the purpose of that? You learn to do something 100% correctly, 100% of the time. There's absolutely no allowance for the slightest imperfection. You've got to get it right. And when you think about that, that's a pretty good ethos and ability,
standard,
you know, to become ingrained in you, that you then take that attitude towards everything that you do. And it was the same uniform inspections. You know, they would look at every button, and they would look behind the buttons if there was a tiny bit of polish left behind the button that you hadn't got off. Then you'd be in the shit. And every morning you got up, you had to make your bed. So the bed, you literally took all the blankets and sheets apart, folded them all up, and you made a thing called a bed pack, which looked a bit like a licorice all salt. And the bed packs had to be exactly square, and the beds had to have hospital corners on the sheet, and they would come in and do an inspection. All your kit would be laid out, all your boots and everything. And if the bed pack wasn't right, if it wasn't quite straight, they just pick it up and throw it out the window. You know, I mean, and you could think, we're 15 years old, this is pretty brutal, you know, and it was. So, so there was all of that going on. And
what was the pursuit, the perfection there? Was that something that was it that sort of scratched an itch in you, where you have felt a degree of satisfaction in getting things perfect? And did that flow through to the rest of your career?
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, I think that I always was, you know, I always had that streak in me. So I can remember when I was a kid and I was making, you know, an Airfix model of a Spitfire or something. I would spend hours painting it just right. I would sit there and look at it and think, that's not quite right. You know. So I mean, I think that was sort of in there anyway. But I think that what they did was that they just made sure that that attitude, you had that attitude for everything that you did, not just the things that you wanted to do or were interested in. You know, but everything. And so that was a big element of it. And you know, in terms of the technical training, well, what we didn't know was that we were learning to you know, maintain and fix aircraft electronic systems, instrument systems, avionics, at a time when they would be the most complicated they would ever be. And what I mean by that was that this was early 1970s, so all of the systems on the aircraft were still analog. There were no computers. We had things called computers, but they were essentially electromechanical in the way that they functioned. And so, if you take a you know, military airplane, which is a pretty complicated thing, because yes, it has all the stuff a civilian airplane has in terms of, you know, autopilots and control systems and navigation systems, but it also has, you know, weapons aiming systems. It has to fly in a much more extreme kind of envelope than a civilian aircraft, and there's much less space, and so on and so forth. So because we were still working on these analog systems, you were able to figure out pretty much exactly what the problem was in a system. If something wasn't working, you could ultimately get down to component level and say, okay, it's this relay in that box which is a function.
How would you do that?
Synchro motor. Well,
because it was so complicated and many moving parts.
So what you started off with was that first of all, they would work it the way that you know, if you're a techie working on a frontline squadron, then what would happen is that when the aircraft came back in, the pilot or the aircrew would come in and they would do a maintenance debrief, and so we would all go in and you know, like the airframe guy, the electrical guy, the air comms guy, the navigation instruments guy, the radar guy. We'd all come and sit down, and then they would kind of go through, well, whatever the snags were. And so so maybe there was one in the navigation system, and so the snag could be, okay, so on the gyro compass, it seemed to be reading out by about 3 degrees, and what we reckon the true heading should have actually have been.
Right.
And so you would then ask some questions about that. Did that seem to be the same on every heading, or was it when you were flying a particular course or something like that?
Yeah, okay.
And so they would give you whatever information they had, and then you would go out to the aircraft and run up the systems. And and the thing about...
Try and replicate it.
Yeah, try and replicate. The thing is that everything's integrated with everything else. Yeah? So...
Right. That'd be interesting.
So sometimes the problem isn't actually with the instrument that you're dealing with.
Right.
It's because it's getting some bit of information from something else in the aircraft, which isn't quite right. And so, for instance, when I worked on the Nimrod aircraft, we had something called an automatic variation computer, which was essentially a box with a vinyl disc in it, and the disc was rotated.
Like a record.
Yeah, rotated according to longitude.
Okay.
Yeah, and it had a pick-off, like just on a record, which went from the outside to the centre of the disc according to latitude. So that information was fed into it.
What information?
Latitude and longitude. Latitude and longitude was fed into it from the ground position indicator.
Okay.
Okay. So, and this was this disc was changed every year, and it was basically like a bumpy disc, and the highs or lows on it equaled the actual magnetic variation in that particular geographical spot, which can vary from 0 to, in a given year, you know, minus 10 degrees or plus 10 degrees, or you know, minus 7 or plus 7, and because the Earth's core, the Earth's magnetic core is basically a big ball of liquid iron. And because the Earth is spinning, there's a Coriolis effect, and that's why magnetic variation actually alters over time.
Right.
And so you look at it and say, well, okay, so it's reading 3 degrees out. That kind of tells me that probably, because we're talking about the true heading, that the information coming from the magnetic variation computer is wrong. Okay? So then you have to think, well, why is it wrong? Well, it could be that bit of kit is wrong, or it could be that it's being fed the wrong latitude and longitude from the ground position indicator. So the first thing you had to do was try and figure out which bit of kit is actually wrong. Yeah, and then you know, we used to have huge books of circuit diagrams which you get out, and you go out there with your multimeter, and you would start kind of checking things, and eventually, you know, we had some test equipment, but it was very, very basic. So mostly, it was actually very like being a doctor, and somebody comes in and says, I've got a bit of a pain in my side, you know, and I don't know what it is. And then the doctor will start asking some questions, and he'll give you a bit of a prod, you know. And it's like that. And but what you learnt was a really, a very logical and kind of disciplined approach to problem solving. So first of all, understand what the problem is. Then go out to the airplane, run everything up, and say, well, is there anything here that's obviously wrong? You know, and then you would eventually figure out what the problem was. And you know, quite often the solution would be, okay, so actually it's the automatic variation computer that's wrong, so I'll change that box. Okay, but sometimes you change the box and that didn't fix it. And then sometimes maybe it's a bad connector somewhere. So that's when you have to get your multimeter out. And you've just got miles and miles and miles and miles of wiring in these aircraft. So, and the thing was that, I mean, when I finished my training, I was on a, you know, a frontline squadron when I was under 18 years old. And within a few months, you're going all around the world. You know, so I could be in Goose Bay in Canada, or I could be down in the Azores, or you know, in Cyprus or wherever, with your aircraft. I remember once we were in Jamaica, and you're the guy. You know, you're the guy who has to. You're the guy who fix that system. There's only one of you, and you're 18 years old. And if something goes wrong, you've got to fix it, and you don't have the resources that you've got back on the base.
Yeah.
You know, and it's amazing what we were able to do. It was,
right.
and I mean, you imagine now, would they give responsibility like that to someone who was 18 years old? And well, you know, the answer is they wouldn't.
Yeah.
And
so it's I'm talking to Jim Furness here on Acheron, his boat, and we've just had breakfast. This is the second of our series, Breakfast with Jim, and we had our breakfast. We're enjoying a coffee and just chatting about his initial work experience joining the RAF and how that really set him up for his future career. And what I hear you saying, Jim, is that the level of perfection, if you like, it seems that, you know, the processes that you learn in the forces are where there cannot be, because at the end of the day, if you're training for battle, ultimately, then you want to make sure everything's working, everyone is working, and every system is working correctly. And that seems to be, you know, as an 18-year-old, getting that level of responsibility must have been a combination of feeling that responsibility, but also, wow, would that happen today? Probably not at all.
No, I mean, you know, I mean, obviously you kind of had like people above you, but like the guy above you who you know, who would have to sign the job off. He might be a crew chief. So yeah, but he might be another trade. He might be an airframe guy or an electrical guy. So he has to take your word for it. You know, because he doesn't know your job. And so there was a lot of trust involved, and also okay, we were always aiming for 100%. But you know, the other side of it was, of course, in the military is that you have a job which you have to get done. So there would be, you know, there certainly would be occasions where a decision will be made. This isn't 100%, but it's good enough because we've got to go, we've got to fly. You know, So although you aim to do everything right every time, sometimes you also learnt, okay, this is a situation we're in. It's not as ideal as we would like, but we reckon we're good enough to go. But at least you are making that decision on the basis of all the right knowledge, and that's actually also a pretty important skill, because if you're a super perfectionist, then you'll never get anything done because nothing will ever be you know, good enough for you to say, right, let's kind of...
Or all the things line up as 100%.
Yeah, so you also have to be able to learn that skill as well, to say, well, okay...
The important things are covered.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the other thing, is understanding what is the really important thing here, and what is actually a detail, which in this scenario doesn't really matter that much. You know.
So let me ask you, because, you know, we've got a lot of people listening to this who haven't had military experience, but they may be building businesses. They're trying to become more excellent in their work. But sometimes because of that, there's not an external reference where you're having some sergeant major scream at you when you've, you know, not performed, or you've dropped your rifle, whatever you've done. And we can easily, in civilian life, I find, we set our own standards. And so sometimes they can vary a lot. Between people. They can be as slack as, or they could be very high. Maybe not perfection as you would if you've, you know, learned that, hey, if I don't get this 100% right, someone's going to come, they're going to notice, and I'm going to be screamed at. But how does you know, people like myself in civilian life, how do we apply those standards which are as good as they can be, practical, maybe not perfect in every respect, but as good as they need to be on the critical stuff? And move on. Is there a way in which we can internally or externally use ways to increase our own performance and our own expectations of ourselves?
I mean, that's a good question. I've never really thought about it because I never had to.
But you've done it in your own, like your own business.
Absolutely. So I think that I think there are other ways that you can achieve the same effect. I mean, certainly, if you're into sport, any kind of sport, there's the opportunity to push yourself there. And there are certain sports, you know, if you're a base jumper, you know, or something like that, you're putting yourself in the same situation where if you're base jumping, you're only ever going to get it wrong once. And that's true of, for instance, sub-aqua. You know, is another area where you know you're putting yourself, you're voluntarily putting yourself in an extreme situation, and you're training for it. You're just training for it in a different way.
Right.
And I think that you can. And I mean, I've certainly known plenty of people who've never been in the forces who have got tremendous self-discipline.
Okay, right.
And incidentally, when I was in the forces, I certainly knew a few people who were pretty rubbish, but you know, somehow managed to get through the system. So I mean, it wasn't perfect in that sense.
So self-discipline, the defining thing we're talking about here.
Yes, self-discipline. I think the other thing that there were a few things the Air Force gave us which I think would be difficult to get in civilian life. So one of the things was that although to begin with they just squashed you, you know, so they just kind of squashed you and kind of took you apart. But then when they put you back together again, you had a degree of self-confidence which you didn't have before. And also, I think that the biggest thing was the sense that whatever problem you're going to throw at me, I'm going to solve it. Right.
So you become pretty big internally.
Yeah, you do. So it's like, well, and so for instance, in the summers we used to go off and, you know, climb mountains. It was called expedition training.
Right.
And I actually took that up as in my spare time as a sport, and I did a lot of very serious rock climbing. And for instance, when I was doing that, you know, I did some quite seriously difficult climbs, where, you know, particularly in Scotland, up in the Cuillins, where you're climbing a 1,000-foot rock face, which is, you know, pretty steep, and as you're free climbing it, and it would come to a point. There's always a point in every climb called the crux, which is the hardest move, and you'd sit there and look at it for a while, but your internal mental process was, I'm going to find a way past this, and I always did, and so.
Good skills for sailing.
That's right, absolutely. So having that sense of,
confidence,
whatever it is, I'm going to figure out a way to deal with this issue, and so you had that, and actually some of the things now would seem very quaint. So for instance, we're talking about being on a parade ground.
I'm making some notes.
Sure. We always had a band.
Okay.
And the weird thing is, when that kind of band strikes up and you're doing, you know, whatever the manoeuvre is, you felt like you were 12 foot tall. I mean, you did. There's something about that. I mean, for me anyway.
Music?
For me, the music, because I mean, you know, the music's there for a reason. It's not nothing.
Right.
Yeah. You know, and so all of those things come together, and you know, you kind of, you know, and you're wearing a uniform, and you know that, okay, I was in the Air Force, so the Air Force is not a very old institution. It's just had its 100th anniversary a couple of years ago, but you know, behind it there's hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition, and the kind of methods they've been using basically haven't changed over all that time. So it's a kind of pretty, I guess it's a pretty proven system. But when they bring all of those things together, so you know, I can definitely remember, maybe not the first time I went home, but certainly the second time I went home, meeting up with my friends who were still at school doing their O-levels. And to be honest, I just looked at them and said, you guys are just shit, you know, you have no idea, you know, so, because they were still schoolboys, you know, but by then I was already well into understanding about aircraft electronics. I could fire an SLR and, you know, run up a mountain and all this kind of stuff, so
it's amazing.
It was a tremendous thing, and I honestly think that, you know, actually, if you're kind of starting out in life and you don't know quite what you want to do, doing a bit of military service isn't a bad thing. You know, you know, you'll definitely get something useful out of it. But anyway,
on that, I love your point there about confidence. There's a Canadian entrepreneur named Dan Sullivan, who I've followed, and I've done some of the courses that they offer, strategic coach. And one of the things he says is the most important thing we need as humans now is confidence.
Yeah.
Because we're living in such a world that's changing, and this is when I was really studying Dan's stuff was pre 2000, pre COVID-19, where we've been forced to change and morph and whatever. But having confidence that comes through doing stuff, getting feedback, adjusting, getting better and better, that's a skill in that process that is so critical to moving on in life. Because otherwise, if we just think that life's predictable, it's going to be the same, we keep on doing the same thing, well, externally, things are changing all the time, whether it's technology, whether it's business, whether it's the world now, the way we operate with, post-COVID-19. And I love that confidence that, you said you felt 12 foot tall.
Yeah.
As a 19-year-old kid.
Yeah.
Could you have, what would have brought that circumstance around to feel that confident in what you're doing? Probably nothing at that age. Maybe, later on there could have been something.
Yes. I don't know.
A lot to be
I
grateful
think
for that.
That's right. I think that the other thing about the training, I guess, was that you just developed this kind of way of particularly because of the job that I was doing, of when you're being given any problem, of picking it apart.
Right.
I mean, very quickly, analysing it very quickly, and figuring out what's the salient bit of information here, what's the nub of the problem. Yeah. And once you've identified the nub of the problem, how are you going to fix it?
Right. Yeah.
And that is a skill, obviously, which in terms of anything else you're going to do in life, whether it's a business, whether it's a relationship, is to be able to home in and say, okay, well, I've got 20 different bits of information here, but what are the really important bits? Yeah, and then so when I figured out what the really important bits of information are, and what's the central issue here, because once you know what the central issue is, then you can come up with a way of addressing it, and also a way of saying, okay, I can't solve this whole problem immediately, but what I can do is I can find the central thing, and I can start hammering away at that.
Sort of zone in.
Yeah, I can zone in. I can start hammering away at that because. And so that if you were looking at an aircraft system, you might say, well, I'm not sure exactly what the problem is here, but first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to eliminate the things that aren't a problem.
Right.
Yeah, and then maybe I'm just going to get this bit working. Once I've got that bit working, I can figure out the rest. And so, so I think it's quite a complex process, and it's like anything in life. Someone could teach it to you. Yeah. That doesn't work.
Theoretically.
You've just got to do it over and over and over and over and over again.
The doing and the execution is the key.
Absolutely. It's like apparently the difference between a concert pianist and a music teacher is the number of hours. So if you want to be a music teacher, you've probably done, in piano, you've probably done 2,000 hours. Yeah. To be a concert level pianist, you've done 10,000 hours, and they reckon that the difference. And people say, "Oh, so and so is a genius or is very talented." Right. Well, no, actually, they've just done it an awful lot. I mean, that's what Mozart started when he was 3. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. Just years in the
because and the sergeant major was his dad, Leopold Mozart, who made the poor little bugger practice every day. Right,
so practice. Never too early to get on and practice.
No, absolutely,
and start developing that skill set.
Yeah,
and getting familiar. I know that I've been guilty in my life in a couple of areas of theorising and not jumping in. Sports and things like that, I've always been a jumper inner. Yeah. Jump in and learn pretty quickly. Yeah. But there's been some other things in my business life where I've thought, because of the arrangement of, I could do this, and I've applied these kind of risk management, these are all the things I've got to look for, that I haven't jumped in and just got my hands dirty. Yeah. But that sounds like and that's what an apprenticeship is, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
It's getting in and actually doing real stuff with your hands. Yeah, with your brain, but and actually seeing, did that work or didn't it? And then straight away you learn. You're on that learning curve.
Yeah, I mean that's right. You're doing it right away, and also you're doing it alongside people who've been doing that job for 20 years, right? Who kind of know what they're doing.
So some guidance there, some structure to it.
So it's an utterly different route to the academic one.
Yeah.
And
so fair to say that the confidence comes through doing. Do you think they're inextricably linked, those things?
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, where you've got a history of being able to look back and say, well, you know, I've done this many times now, and I know that I'm going to get it right. And if it's fixing an aircraft system, it's kind of like, well, I don't know what this problem is, a new problem. I haven't come across it before, but hey, last week I had something else which was completely new, and we were able to get to the bottom of it. Interestingly, you know, now, well, you know, 40 years on, I'm living on a boat and sailing long distances, and we've discovered that when I'm out sailing, quite often a problem presents itself, and
they just kick in automatically. Those skills.
And yeah, it does, because and the problem that presents itself, well, you've never heard anybody else who's had this problem, and you never read an article about it in Yachting Monthly or whatever it was. You just have to figure it out. But it's a sense of, okay, I'm just going to figure it out.
First principles.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think this generation's losing that? Because we tend to outsource many things which are direct experiences, don't we? For example, I've heard, and I've even fallen prey to this myself a couple of times, where young kids are aren't reading books, and so the ability to construct a sentence and even to spell correctly has been almost made devoid or irrelevant, because now we can use Translate, for example, or we can use a dictionary program or something that can. And so there's not that mentality of having learnt by doing, by reading. But we've got technology to bridge that gap. But we're kind of losing confidence, I think, in terms of how we really communicate.
So I think that's very true, and it's concerns me. I notice that they're always advertising these apps. When someone says, "Hey, have you ever been in that situation where you're talking to someone and you just can't quite find the right word or the right phrase, and so we've got this great app that will do it for you." And I'm thinking, and that just drives me mad to think, well, actually, yes, if you read a bit and got a reasonable grasp of the English language, you wouldn't have to do that. And also, there's an enormous pleasure in having a vocabulary that allows you to express exactly what you want with the right nuance and the right emphasis. And so that is, I think that's a great loss. And I can remember, before I joined the Air Force, and when I was like 13, 14, I was reading 3 books a week. And it's very interesting that well, if you take Winston Churchill, for instance, who's a bit of a hero of mine, well, he didn't go to university, but he read a lot of books, and he ultimately won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And as we know, he was a great orator, and he had a fantastic vocabulary and a grasp of the English language, and that actually turned out to be pretty important. So I think that is a thing. I think the other problem is as well is that we infantilise young people. Okay, I joined the Air Force when I was 15, but if you go back 100 years, you could join the Navy, the Royal Navy, as a midshipman at the age of 11. You were starting at the age of 11. And also another interesting story, there's a very famous place in Scotland called New Lanark, which is it's a mill town, and it was built from scratch by the mill owner. I can't remember his name, but he built this kind of model town. So it had the mill, which was a textile mill, but it also had all the housing, terrace housing, which all had running water and loos, which in the 19th century was quite unusual. They had a school and a hospital. This guy built this town when he was 22. Okay, he started as an apprentice to a mill owner when he was 11 years old. By the time he was 22, he was effectively a multi-millionaire, and he went on to actually found a kind of model community in America. So he's doing that when he's 22. Now, most people when they're 22, they're still just trying to figure out whether they're going to go on to do a master's or a PhD. And so I think that's a big, for me, that's a big problem. That actually young people are way more capable than we give them credit if you give them the opportunity, and if you're not afraid to give them a good kick up the backside, which of course we are now.
We're constrained in some ways.
Yes.
So Jim, tell us. So I see two things that I'd just like to explore as we go through, and number one is how those experiences set you up in terms of building a successful business. And then also how those skill sets as well and that confidence has helped you be able to take the decision to buy this boat, invest in this boat, and with the goals you've got of doing some extensive sailing. So first of all, with your business, because you developed your business, correct me if I'm wrong, but you've developed some pretty, you were the leader in some applications that you developed. And no, I don't mean applications as in apps.
No.
But actual solutions to industry problems, particularly in deep sea oil drilling and these sorts of things. And to what extent did the confidence you had from your skill set that developed in the RAF set you up to be able to put pieces together of technology and hardware, and also the right people to build solutions that were pretty unique?
So, I after I came out of the Air Force, I decided that I wanted to do something somewhat different. I actually went into sales, and the first job I got was actually selling vacuum cleaners to housewives, and it was Kirby vacuum cleaners actually. And you had to go around. It was a very expensive vacuum cleaner with all these attachments, and you had to go around to these people's houses and demonstrate it. And so it was a really, really hard job. And then from then I went on to selling photocopiers. And that was just equally hard, driving around an industrial estate, going to every business, and a lot of the time just getting abuse and getting thrown out, and you were living on commission.
Very persistent.
You lived on commission, and it was very...
must have been tough after being in such a structured environment where you're paid every week.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very, very tough, but it taught me about selling.
Right.
And one of the things which I learned by doing that was I learned how to read people.
Okay.
And also, to the extent of like when you're talking to someone, just looking at their expression to see, okay, I'm kind of going off track here because he's losing interest. This guy's losing interest. And also, of course, my analysis skill was very good. If I went into to see a company, and I would ask them what type of copier they got, and what model was it, and how many copies a month were they doing. And then you could kind of quickly figure out, hey, what, the thing they've got is too small, or they need a collator, or I don't know, whatever it was. And so you would kind of home in on whatever it was, and you'd say, well, look, if I could offer you for the same monthly cost a photocopier that would do A3 as well as A4, and it'd also have a collator on it, would you be interested? Because they'd always say, oh, well, we're happy with what we got, we're not going to change it. And they say, well, yeah, of course, because they think you can't possibly do that, but you've actually already done the arithmetic in your head. So, well, no, actually, I can.
So is that sales to you? What is sales? What's your definition of sales?
Well, I mean, what's my definition? I've never thought about that. It's just... It actually transformed. So that was pure sales. You're going in there, and if you possibly can, you're going to create an opportunity for you to sell them a new bit of kit. And in order to do that, you had to find out what the weak point was. That certainly, when I started my business, really that wasn't the idea at all. It was worked in a completely different way. But having those basic sales skills are very, very
so it's better matching up the problem and then tailoring or just introducing a solution.
Yes.
That's a sale.
Yeah.
Is that a sale for you?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Because often I think we get this idea of sales is that we're trying to convince the person of something that they maybe don't even need or want. But I think that's what sales is. Because we're always in the business of selling, whether that's selling a product and physically exchanging, but you might be selling to a lady you've met, of the virtues of you going out, of them coming out with you, rather than staying home and watching Netflix.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much a case of exactly. It's very much a case of finding out where somebody are, what they've got, and then being able to analyse it and say, okay, you know what, I've got something here which I think will be of benefit to you.
Right.
It's actually going to in some way improve your life or the efficiency of your business.
Operation,
or you know, your operation or whatever it is. So, but I guess the big thing that I got from that was the kind of personal skills.
Yes.
And and
so the listening.
Listening
and
and also there's a great line in the New Testament which St. Paul says, "I'm all things to all men."
Right. Right.
And you know, one of the things that you
I often read that as when I first read that many years ago, I thought, well, this guy's he's got no standards. He's a prostitute. He's just wanting to give whatever's required. But I think more what he's saying is what you're alluding to, is that he was willing to be whatever was required for that situation.
I think it's actually no, I think it's deeper than that.
Right.
When we say I'm all things to all men. And that for me has been a guiding principle over many years now. It is that whoever I am talking to, and certainly I found this later on when I built my business, you know, I could be going into a company, I might be talking to the managing director, or I might be talking to the maintenance guy on the shop floor, and I would alter my approach accordingly, because the reality is, I know what it's like to be that guy in a pair of overalls fixing the problem, and also as a businessman, I know what it's like to employ people, deal with finances, blah blah blah. And so when I'm talking to that person, it's not that I'm not being genuine, but with the maintenance guy, I'm getting alongside him and saying, you know what, I'm just another engineer, and I'm going to help you fix this problem and get this bit of machinery rolling. And they love that. They don't want someone to come and to sell them something. They want someone who's going to help them fix their problem. And so if you're talking to the managing director of the business, you might have a completely different approach. You might be telling you about, you know, what the product is or the service they're providing, where they're hoping to go with the business, what they want to do, and you would then be listening to them as a kind of businessman and saying, well, you know, actually, maybe we've got something here which this is not what I came to talk to you about, but you might be able to incorporate this in your business, and it might actually open a whole new area for you. Oh, that's really interesting, you know. So,
well, I think you gave me once an example of how you'd done that with a particular piece of kit that you'd then developed.
So I spent a number of years, you know, doing sales, and then I went into technical sales, which was the obvious thing for me to do, which is what I wanted to do. So I was mostly working in the oil industry then, up in Aberdeen, and I spent some time working for an American company that made diver communication systems and subsea tracking systems, and I actually travelled all over Europe.
This is for offshore oil drilling?
Yeah, but some of it, but also some of it was like research and development. So I could be dealing with, you know, a German manufacturer of submarines, or a company up in Norway, you know, Statoil or somebody like that who's drilling in the North Sea. Met a lot of different and interesting people. So I kind of did that for a few years, and then ultimately ended up starting my own business. And so to begin with, all I was doing was selling products. So I had a range of sensors that I was selling for pressure, temperature, vibration, flow, and so on and so forth. And then after a while, I started adding to that data loggers and data acquisition units. So in other words, little black boxes that you can plug these sensors into and then record what they're measuring in solid state memory, and then retrieve it at a later date.
Okay, for example, give us an example so that...
a typical application, and this kind of develops over time, because when I started off there wasn't remote monitoring didn't really exist. And so, for instance, you could have, you might have someone in a university doing a research project on habitat, you know, for you know, particular animals, and so we would have to build a system. We did one I can't remember the name of the university now. It was in the UK, but anyway, they were doing an experiment with fruit flies. So they had colonies of fruit flies, and they had locations throughout southern and northern Europe. So they had locations in Spain. They also had them in Germany and way up in the far north of Sweden. And these fruit flies would be in a little kind of cage outside, and what they wanted to do was, so they'd be in, you know, some place in Spain, and there we'd be monitoring the temperature, the humidity, the incoming global solar radiation. Those are probably the main parameters, and so they'd want to monitor them. We would actually have the sensors plugged into a unit, and actually we would use GPRS to send that data to our web server, so we could put it on a web page. So if you're, you know, in the University of Birmingham or whatever it is, you could kind of sit there and look at what's happening pretty much in real time. But you also had all this data saved, and then what they would do is they'd say, okay, you know, you've had a month in the sun in Spain. We're going to move you to the far north of Finland now and see how you get on there. And so you needed, you know, everything had to be replicated in exactly the same way. And so that would be a typical job that we would do. The university would come along and say, hey, look, I've got this project, you know, monitoring how fruit flies react in different environments, and we've got all these different places we have to put the stuff in, and we have to get all the data back here. And so, you know, I'd be able to say, okay, well, these are the sensors we need to use. This is a data acquisition unit. It's going to have to be packaged in a particular way because it's going to be out in the middle of nowhere, not only in Spain, where it could be very hot and sunny, but in the north of Finland, where it could be very cold. It's got to have a power source. You know, how are we going to do that? And so you would, you know, I would learn. I was able to figure that out from first principles. You know, how to put that system together. And, so that was one thing, and then the other thing that would happen was that, for instance, with my customers in Aberdeen, I used to go and visit them, and maybe I'm selling a customer one particular unit, and there was a particular company that I went to see who I didn't actually really understand what they did, but they were involved in some way in the commissioning of subsea pipelines. And I used to just sell them a few basic sensors, and then one day I said, hey, this is great, you know, I really appreciate your business. You know, is there anything else I could do for you? And this guy said, well, you know, I don't think so. He said, but I tell you, we have got this problem. And the problem was that they had to monitor it when they're commissioning a pipeline. They had to monitor all these processes on the seabed down at about 2,000 or 3,000 meters. They had to monitor the temperature and the pressure, and they had a system they were using because when they commissioned a pipeline, they have to purge it with seawater with certain concentrations of chemicals. And so, and then they have to be able to prove to the client, who might be, you know, Shell or BP or Exxon Mobil, whoever it is, they had to be able to prove to them they'd done this job properly. So when they put this bit of equipment on the seabed to do it, they needed a piece of measurement and data logging equipment that would do it. And so they came to me and said, look, we've got this system, it isn't really kind of working, and it's very expensive, and it was a custom design. And
so was it remote? Would the data come to
no, they would recover, so they would send the system down, it would spend 3 weeks on the seabed, and then when they brought it back up, they would recover the data. But it had to have a display, because if they needed to make adjustments, because they were like valves and things where they adjusted flows, they would send an ROV down with a camera that would look at the display, and they would adjust it with the manipulators until they got it right. So anyway, so he showed me the system they were using, which was a bespoke system designed from kind of board level up. And I said, look, I'm pretty sure I can make you a system that will do the same job, but all of the components will be off the shelf. There will be nothing, there will be no hardware that is a custom design. It will all be off the shelf kit.
So in other words, cheaper.
Cheaper, but also you're then not stuck with a single source of supply. And so that's what I did. You know, I knew who made the right type of pressure sensors.
Right.
I knew who could make the flow meters, and we had to do a little bit of work with the flow meter manufacturer to ensure that they would work down at 2,000-3,000 meters. Then the data logger actually came from an Australian company. So
which year are we talking?
This is going back, I don't know, about 10 years ago now. The pressure sensors came from Switzerland. The flow meters are made in the UK. The data logger came from Australia. The underwater display was also made in the UK. So the bits we had to do was, for instance, although we didn't have to change any hardware, in the data logger we needed to put a program in that would collect all this data.
To assimilate it somehow.
And would also send the data out of its serial port in a way that the display could read it and display it. And so I had to, so I knew basically how to make it work, but I had to bring in someone who could write that program, which I did. So I knew who would do that, because it wasn't the Australian company who made the data logger. It was another guy working in the UK who was a bit of an expert in programming, and so I was able to get him to write the program for me.
So quite a project.
Yeah,
all these different components and resources.
Exactly. And then the other thing was, it all had to be put in a housing that was going to be good for 2,000-3,000 meters of water. It would need a power supply that was going to work for that time, and of course all the cabling and connectors had to be good for all of that. And so it needed to bring in various different people, but the thing was that I was able to kind of work out in here how everything would all the different bits would talk to each other. And of course I was also able to sit down with the customer and he would explain what he wanted. And I would say, oh, okay, I understand what it is you want. I understand what your objective is, and so I think we can do this. And ultimately, so we built that first system, and it was a huge success.
Was
and
it?
They ended up, they ended up
like it was first of that type.
Well, there were other systems that existed, but the beauty of what we did was that it was from standard components, and actually it was about 1/10 of the cost of the bespoke system that they were buying. And the problem with the bespoke system that they bought is if anything went wrong with it, they just had to go back to this one company. So that was really a great success, and we ran that system for a number of years, and then they ultimately came back to us and said, "Hey, look, this is great, but we're needing to do some more things now." And it was apparent that the core kind of brain, which was the data logger that was made in Australia, just couldn't do it. And although we probably could have made it do it, it used a lot of power. And we were getting to the stage where the battery system that was required to run this thing was huge. And so we said, okay, we need to kind of start again. Well, by this time I'd developed relationships with manufacturers all over the world, and I developed a very close relationship with a manufacturer in Switzerland of very small, low-powered data logging equipment, and they didn't have something that would do the job off the shelf. But by that time I was good friends with the managing director of the company. I used to go over there. We used to go walking together in the Swiss Alps, and then he would come to Scotland, and we'd go off and do trips together. So we were good friends at that point. And so I was able to ring him up and say, "Hey, look, I've got this application, and I think you might be able to make a bit of kit that will do the job." And actually, so I explained the application to him, and I said, and he was able to say, "Well, we've actually already got a piece of hardware which is a good basis for it." They actually had to redesign it, so it was actually new hardware. Then they actually had to do custom firmware, and then we also did for the client a custom software front end setup, which just gave them exactly the kind of the buttons and the menus that they needed,
Right.
and nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to do that because I actually, having worked with them for several years, I
Yes.
knew exactly what it was they
Their
wanted, and so we
capabilities,
produced this new system.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it was just a quantum leap
Right. Yeah,
in capability.
Mhm.
I mean, you know, there were a few teething troubles, as there always are.
Yeah.
And that was, you know,
Had to work through that.
yeah, it definitely had to work through that. And so I found that, you know, for me, what I really enjoyed about this whole process
Mhm.
is that here's a guy who left school when he was 15,
Mm-hmm.
you know, no qualifications,
Mm-hmm.
trained in the Air Force, started my own business, started developing these solutions,
Mhm.
and we developed, you know, many other types of solutions. And we were dealing with a lot of blue chip companies,
Mm-hmm.
and involved in all sorts of quite interesting projects.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the enormous pleasure and satisfaction of being able to come up with these solutions
Mm-hmm.
and present them. And you know, my process would often be, you know, I'd be thinking about this. So a customer would come on the phone, or they would say, "I've got, you know, whatever this problems we need to do," and I would go away and think about it, and I wouldn't necessarily always, you know, come up with a solution, but I would think about it, and then I kind of developed this process over a period of time where I have terrible insomnia. You know, I have really bad insomnia, and so I'm usually awake at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning for about 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd wake up and I'd say, okay, what am I going to do? And I'd say, well, I'm going to think about this thing for an hour.
Okay.
And I would just think about it.
Yeah.
And then I would think about all the different aspects, and then I would go back to sleep. Yeah. And then I might do that for a week. And then one morning I'd wake up at 5 o'clock and I'd go,
Got it.
I've got it.
Really?
Yeah, I've got it.
What was happening? How do you come up with that solution without being conscious of it?
Well, because I think that I think the process there is that what you need to do is you need to clearly understand what all the different elements are of any particular problem, and you need to have thought about it long enough so that that's really sunk in. You really kind of got it, and then actually, so there's this bit of the process where you've almost got too much information, okay, and that's where I think where the subconscious clicks in. I mean, I'm not a psychologist; I don't really understand anything about this stuff, but it definitely works. Think through a problem, think through it a few times, and then sleep on it. That's why people, you know, always say you give someone, so you say, you know, you want someone to make a big decision. It's like, hey, you know, I want to sail around the world, and someone will say, that sounds like a really great idea, but you know what? Let me sleep on it. You know, and that's what we say. Let me sleep on it. Right. And the thing is that what happens then is that your brain, your subconscious, now you've kind of got your conscious brain out of the way, your subconscious is able to somehow assemble all that information and pull out, you know, a decision, yes or no, or a new idea, or a new way of doing it.
Is it like you've built some structure? You build a structure, you know, I'm thinking in terms of my experience in building things, you know, you build the structure and then you fit it out. You know, so the first phase, bang, knock it up.
Yeah.
And then you let your subconscious, is what you're saying, you build some sort of, you know, outline, and then you let your subconscious go to bring the parts together or bring some creativity to it.
I think often what your subconscious does is it comes up with the thing that you've missed.
Right, okay.
And I found that, you know, when I've been problem solving, so I can remember once we installed a big data acquisition and monitoring system on a generator plant out in the Western Isles of Scotland, in the middle of nowhere, and a bit of it just wasn't working.
Right.
And I'd gone through the wiring, you know, 100 times and couldn't figure it out. You know, I went to sleep that night in a hotel, and I woke up the next morning, and you know, it was just like, yeah, that's it. I know exactly what it is now. Yeah. And it was kind of like I actually needed to stop thinking about it, and then it's like my subconscious was able to point out the thing that was right in front of me, but I'd actually missed it.
Wow, that's exciting. Yeah.
And that actually works in...
It's a practical skill.
Many, many different ways. I mean, another example is that I'm a photographer,
yeah.
Okay, and I do fine art photography, and I'll do a photo shoot, my style of photography is that I shoot I shoot nude figures in big landscapes, and that's a subject we can talk about another time.
Yeah,
but I've got this thing about...
You have to make that an audio-visual.
Yeah. I've got this thing about just trying to explain in pictorial terms who we are, what our place is in the world.
Right.
But one of the things that I find is I'll do a photo shoot, and we'll go to a particular location and we'll do all these photographs, and then initially you sit down and you immediately pick out half a dozen images and you think, yeah, that's great. And sometimes when you're working, there's this golden moment when you think, that's it, that's it, that really works.
Time, light.
Everything. It's that kind of golden moment. Everything comes together. But what is really fabulous, and I love this, is that, and I did this recently, I went back through the raw images of a photo shoot I did 7 or 8 years ago, and it was just this astounding image, which I pulled it out. I never even bothered with it before. I'd looked at it, but I didn't even bother to process it. And I looked at it and thought, that is just bloody amazing.
Wow.
So sometimes...
well, why is that? Because you're almost like your own understanding is caught up over those years?
I think that's developed. I think that's partly it. Yes, that will happen. I think also as well, I mean, typically that process works about 3 months after, the initial photo shoot. It's just like, because it's the same thing. It's like you've been through, you've picked out all the obvious stuff, but here's the little gem that you've missed, and I don't know why it works in that way, but it does work in that way. And of course it's a great experience. It's like panning for gold, and all of a sudden you kind of
come across the nugget.
Yeah, you come across this nugget and you think, this is great. And so quite how that applies to business, I don't know. I think it's just a lot of people think that the way to be successful in business is you have to come up with some great, really clever idea, and then you're going to put it out there, and you're going to make a lot of money. And a lot of people now, particularly with the web, think that's what they're going to do. And I remember meeting somebody a while ago and said, oh yeah, I read about this person who made £1 million, and the way they did it was they said that they got everyone to say, okay, I'm going to make a picture of 1 million pixels, okay, and each person, you can create whatever's going to be in that pixel, and I'll put it on my image, and you pay £1. And they made £1 million. They thought, this is a really great idea. Well, okay, it's I suppose that is a great idea. And my response to that has always been, if you want to make money, what you need is a skill or some knowledge which is useful to society. That's how you're going to make money, where you can actually go and provide that service or that body of knowledge, which actually is going to be useful to people, because then you're not trying to sell something to someone. You've actually got something that people want, and that they need.
That's good.
So don't sit around trying to dream up some clever idea. Just say, actually, what is it that I'm good at? Okay, and how can I apply that in a useful way?
That's great.
And then there's enormous pleasure in it, because you're not just some dick who's made a lot of money from something that's useless. Sorry, that's a terrible way of putting it. But you've actually done something that's worthwhile.
That's a great way.
You've actually made a contribution. And you can feel proud of it. And then when you're sitting in your shiny new boat or whatever it is, you can say, well, I wasn't just some lucky guy who happened to make a load of money on the stock market or something. I did something useful. So
I think that's a great place to finish our talk today.
Okay.
And that's a great summary. I love that.
Okay.
We're going to come back for number 3.
All right.
Third breakfast with Jim.
All right.
Shortly. And thanks, Jim. Have a good day. Thanks, mate.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah.